The kitchen light in the farmhouse came on at 4:30, the way it had come on every morning for 54 years, and Alma Rennick stood at the stove in her worn mustard cardigan, waiting for the kettle. She was 78 years old that spring. She was a small woman, thin through the shoulders, a little stooped now. With short white hair she cut herself, and reading glasses she pushed up into it when she wanted to see something far off. The cardigan had been mended twice at the elbows with yarn that did not quite match, and she wore it over a long gray house dress and thick brown stockings and the brown work boots she kept by the door. She had come into that kitchen as a bride, and she had never once expected to leave it. Outside the window, the Rennick home place lay flat and black in the dark, 320 acres of bottom ground that her husband Harlan had drained and worked and paid for twice over, once with money and once with his back. There was the barn with the tin roof, the machine shed, the 2 grain bins. The lane running out to the township road between 2 rows of soft maples she had planted the year the youngest boy started school. It was good dirt. Everybody in the county said so. When the co-op man came out to take soil samples, he used to say the Rennick bottom would grow anything you had the nerve to plant, and Harlan would say the ground did the work and he only steered. Harlan had been dead 4 years by then. He went the way farmers go, in the middle of a job, sitting down against a wheel to catch his breath and never getting up again, and Alma had found him at noon with the tractor still running. She had kept the place going after him, the only way a woman of 74 can keep a place going, which is by hiring out the field work and doing everything else herself, and she had done it well enough that nobody had cause to talk. She paid the taxes on time. She kept the fences up. She still put in a garden every year that fed half the township. Her sons came out on the first Saturday in April with a folder. Dale was the older one, 53 that year. A heavy-set man with his father's shoulders and none of his father's patience, and he had farmed alongside Harlan since he was old enough to reach the clutch. Curtis was 48 and sold crop insurance out of an office in town, and he had gone to a barber instead of letting his wife cut his hair, and he wore a gray sport coat to his mother's kitchen on a Saturday morning. They came in without knocking because it had never been a house where anybody knocked, and they sat down at the same oilcloth table where they had eaten every breakfast of their childhood, and Dale set the folder down and put his hand flat on it as if it might get away. "We got to talk about the ground, Ma," he said. She poured them coffee first. She always did. Then she sat down across from her own children with her hands around her cup, and she listened while they explained to her, patiently, the way people explain things to somebody they have already decided is not quite following, that the estate needed to be settled, that she was 78, that the taxes were going up and the ground was worth too much to sit in one old woman's name, that if anything happened to her, and God forbid, the whole thing would go through the ringer and cost the family a fortune, and it was better to do it now, cleanly, while everybody was sitting at the same table and getting along. "It's a fair division," Curtis said. "We had Ray Ludden draw it up. He's done half the farms in Wexler County." Dale opened the folder and turned a plat map around so it faced her. Somebody had gone over the parcel lines with a pencil and a straightedge, and the pencil had made 3 shapes out of the only place she had ever lived. The home place, the farmhouse and the barns, and the whole of the Black Bottom, all 320 acres of it, was shaded with one set of lines, and it went to Dale. Because Dale farmed it, and had farmed it for 30 years, and it would be a crime, Curtis said, to break up a working operation. The road 80 on the far side of the creek, the machinery, the grain bins, and the pivot went to Curtis to even things out, because Curtis had not taken his share in labor the way Dale had. And then there was the third shape. It sat at the top of the map along the north line where the ground quit being flat and humped up into a ridge of gray ledge and cedar and briar, 40 acres. It was drawn with a wavy pencil line that did not follow anything in particular because nobody had ever cared exactly where that piece began and ended. "And that's yours," Dale said. "The Stone Hill." Nobody in Wexler County called it the Stone Hill. What they called it, and what her sons had called it since they were boys, was the junk hill, the junk ground. It was 40 acres you could not plow, could not pasture worth anything, could not build on without blasting, and could not sell because there was nobody on God's earth who wanted it. There was a spring seep at the base of it that made mosquitoes in July. There were cedars coming up through the rock the way cedars do when the ground is given up. Harlan had run a few dry cows up there one summer and had brought them home again after 2 of them came up lame on the ledge. The tax card at the courthouse carried the whole 40 at $900, which came to $22.50 an acre, and the assessor had not changed that figure in longer than either boy had been alive because nobody had ever given him a reason to. You keep the hill, Curtis said, and he said it kindly, the way you might offer somebody the last piece of bread. It stays in your name, so it's not like you're being left with nothing. There's no place on it to live, Alma said. Dale had thought of that. Dale had thought of everything, and that was the part that sat with her longest afterward, that it had all been thought about somewhere else, in some other kitchen, before anybody thought to ask her. There was the hired man's house at the end of the north lane, 2 rooms and a porch and a working well, where Vernie Sowash had lived for 11 years when they still kept a hired man. It stood, as it happened, on the near corner of the 40. It needed a roof, and it needed a stove, and Dale said he would see to both. Sherry, Dale's wife, had already measured the farmhouse kitchen for cabinets. Alma learned that later from Sherry's sister at the co-op. She looked at the plat map for a long time. She was not a foolish woman, and she was not a soft one, and there was a part of her that wanted to take the folder and put it in the cook stove and tell the 2 of them to go home. But she had raised them, and she knew what came after that. She knew the phone calls. She knew the way Dale would go quiet at Thanksgiving and the way Curtis would send a card instead of coming. And she knew that a woman of 78 who has buried her husband does not have an unlimited number of Thanksgivings left to spend on being right. So she asked one question. She asked it plainly, and both her sons answered it too fast. Is this what your father would have done? Dad would have wanted the operation kept whole, Dale said. Dad would have wanted you taken care of, Curtis said. Ray Ludden came out on a Tuesday with the papers and a notary stamp and a pen. He made a small ceremony of clicking. Alma signed her name 11 times. She signed the farmhouse and the barns and the black bottom over to her older son, and she signed the road 80 and the machinery over to her younger one, and then Ray turned over the last set of papers and said, "And this one conveys the North 40 into your sole name, Mrs. Rennick, free and clear, in fee simple." He said it in the voice men use for the part of a job that does not matter. Dale was looking at his phone. Curtis was looking out the window at the maples. She signed. Ray stamped. It took 9 minutes to move a lifetime. The moving took 11 days. Dale sent his hired help with a trailer, and they carried out the bed she had slept in for 54 years, and the pie safe her mother had brought up from Kentucky, and the tin box off the top shelf of the closet where Harlan had always kept the papers, and they set it all down in 2 rooms at the end of the north lane, with the tin roof ringing overhead. Sherry brought a casserole the first night and said the little house had good bones. Curtis called on Sunday from town and asked how she was settling. Nobody said the word sorry because in their own minds, nobody had anything to be sorry for. They had given their mother a house and 40 acres. They said so to people. In a county that talks, that is what got said. What got said the other way, out at the co-op and in the parking lot after church, was shorter. Dale Rennick took the farm and left his mother the junk. Alma did not answer any of it. She hung her cardigan on the nail by the door of the little house, the way she had hung it on the nail by the door of the big one, and she scrubbed 2 rooms until they smelled like her own kitchen. and she put the tin box on the table under the window because that was where the light was best. And on the 9th of May, when the recorder's office mailed her the recorded copy of her own deed with the county stamp bled through purple on the back, she made a cup of tea, and she sat down at that table, and she read it. She read it because she had time now. And because reading was one of the two things she had never quit doing, and because Harlan had told her once, in the middle of a fence line argument with the man to the west, that the only thing that had ever kept anybody's ground under them was the paper it was written on. A deed is not a long document. Most of it is words nobody says out loud. She read it twice, with her glasses down, and once out loud with them up, slowly, the way you read something in church. It gave her name. It gave the legal description, the section and the township and the range and the 40 acres in the northeast corner. And then it came to the part that every deed in the country carries and that nobody in her family had bothered to read. The part the lawyers call the granting clause and the appurtenance language, and it said that the parcel was conveyed to her in fee simple, together with all and singular the tenements, hereditaments and appurtenances thereunto belonging or in any wise appertaining, and all the estate, right, title, interest, claim, and demand whatsoever of the grantors, and all rights thereto belonging. Under that, typed in a different machine's letters, indented on a rider that had plainly been copied forward out of an older instrument the way riders get copied forward for 100 years without anybody rereading them, were 4 more lines. Together with all quarry rights, quarry privileges, and all stone, quarried and unquarried, lying in and upon said premises, together with the derrick, tramway, rails, tools, and all cut and dressed block presently lying in the quarry yard, together with a right-of-way for hauling 40 feet in width from said quarry yard south along the Old Stone Road to the section line, over and across the northwest quarter, said right-of-way to run with the land and to bind the heirs and assigns of the grantors forever, reserved and conveyed as of the 11th day of October, 1952. Alma Rennick sat in a 2-room house at the end of a lane with a cup of tea going cold at her elbow and read those 4 lines through 3 times. She knew there had been a quarry. Everybody her age knew there had been a quarry, the way you know a thing from the outside, as a word people used about a place. The Rennick Quarry. Harlan's grandfather had opened it, back when the courthouse and the 2 big churches and half the bridge abutments in 3 counties came out of the ridges along the creek, and it had run with a steam derrick and a gang of 40 men and its own spur off the branch line. It had gone quiet in 1952. When the branch line pulled its rails and the trade went to the big beds down south and the gate had been shut and chained and the cedars had come up, and in the 50 years after that a family that had made itself into corn farmers had let the whole business slide out of memory. Harlan had never worked a day in it. Dale had never seen it open. To Dale, it was the junk. But a deed does not forget. A deed is the one thing on a farm that does not care what anybody remembers. She went out the next morning, early, because she still woke at 4:30, and there was no cow to milk and no man to feed. She wore the mustard cardigan and the boots, and she took the handle off a broken hoe to knock the briars back with, and she walked north up the lane between the fence and the cedars with the sun coming up on her left side. It is a 1/4 mile from the hired man's house to the top of the North 40. She had not walked it in 11 years. The lane quit being a lane about halfway and became a track, and then the track became 2 ruts filled with last year's leaves, and then she noticed that the ruts were not ruts. They were too even. She got down on one knee in the wet leaves, which at 78 is a decision and not a motion, and she pulled the mat back with the hoe handle, and there was iron under it. 2 rails, narrow gauge, laid on ties that had rotted to sponge, running straight up the hill under 50 years of leaf mold. She followed them. The cedars closed over the top of the track, so it was like walking up the inside of a green pipe, and then they opened, and there was a gate. It was a farm gate of a kind nobody makes now, welded out of well pipe, 12 feet across, hung on a stone post that had been drilled and set with lead. A cable ran from the post into the brush on either side. On the middle rail, somebody had wired a tin sign, and the paint had gone entirely, and the only thing left of whatever it had said was the row of holes where the letters had been punched. The chain on the latch was as thick as her thumb, and it had rusted into one solid piece with the padlock, and the whole thing was so plainly settled and finished and forgotten that Alma stood in front of it for a full minute with her hand on the pipe. Then she walked around it. The cable had a gap where a cedar had grown up through it and pushed it out of line. And a small old woman in a cardigan does not need much of a gap. She came out of the brush onto flat ground, into a yard of gray stone chips with grass in it, and she stopped, because the world ended 20 feet in front of her boots. The quarry lay open below her in the morning light like a room with the roof taken off. It was cut square. That was the first thing, and it was the thing she was not ready for. She had expected a hole, a gravel pit sort of a place, sloped and slumped and grown over. This was not a hole. It was a rectangle in the earth the size of 2 church lots, with walls that went down in clean vertical faces, and every face was scored with the fine parallel grooves of a channeling machine, floor to rim. Straight as a plumb line. The stone was the pale gray buff of the courthouse in town, and where the sun came across it, the grain lit up warm as bread crust. On the far side, the cut stepped down in benches, 3 of them, each one a good man's height, so that the whole thing went away from her like a stair built for something much larger than people. Water stood in the bottom, still and green-black and perfectly flat, and the cut faces went down into it and kept going down inside it where she could see them for another 20 feet before the green closed over. The depth of it made her hold on to a cedar. From the rim to the water was, she guessed then, and learned later she had guessed low, better than 60 feet. From the water to the floor was more, and in the yard at her back and along the whole north side of the cut where a crane had once swung lay the stone. Blocks, sawn blocks, squared and true, some of them shoulder high and long as a car, laid in courses on oak skids that had rotted out from under one end of them so that they sat crooked and half sunk in the sod. Grass had grown up between them. A cedar had come up through one course and lifted a block a hand's width off its neighbor and held it there. There were dozens of them in the yard. There were more in a long row under the derrick, and more again on a loading platform of squared timbers at the head of the tramway where they had been stacked ready to go down the hill to a spur that no longer existed. Every one of them was dressed on 4 sides. Every one of them had a mark on the end in yellow crayon, faded to a stain, that gave a coarse letter and a number, the way stone gets marked when it has been cut to somebody's drawing for somebody's building. The derrick still stood, a stiff-legged derrick with a mast of riveted plate as thick through as a silo and a boom 50 feet long. The whole thing braced back into 2 great blocks of set stone, and its cable hung slack and orange from the boom point with a hook at the end of it, swinging maybe an inch in the wind, over nothing, 40 feet above the yard, the way it had been left when a man threw the brake at quitting time and went home and did not come back. Alma Rennick stood in that yard for the better part of an hour. Then she went back down the hill and made her dinner and did the dishes and sat a while, and at 4 p.m. she walked to the road and got in the car she still drove on Sundays and went to see Buell Ivers. Buell was 81, and he lived alone at the edge of town in a house with a swing on the porch and a Ford in the drive that he no longer had the license to run. He had been a boy on the Quarry crew, the last crew, the water boy, and then the tool nipper, and then, at the end, a hand on the channeler. When Alma said the word Quarry, he set down his glass and looked at her the way an old man looks at a door he thought was locked. "You been up there," he said. "I own it," she said. He laughed at that, not unkindly, and then he stopped laughing when he saw her face. So they sat on the porch until the streetlight came on, and Buell Ivers told her what she had walked into. He told her it was mill block, which he had to explain, and the explaining took a while, and she listened to all of it. Not crushed stone, not road rock, not the gravel that comes out of a pit with a loader and goes on the county roads by the ton. Dimension stone, building stone, the kind you saw out in blocks and ship on flat cars and cut into steps and sills and courses in the fronts of banks. He said the ledge in that ridge ran clean and blue-hearted with no seam and no clay and no shell in it for 80 feet of thickness, which he said was a freak of a thing. And he said the drillers had proved it in 3 places before the war, and the proof holes were logged and the logs went to the courthouse. He told her the crew had been cutting an order in the fall of 1952. A big one. Courses and steps for a state building somewhere east, and that the blocks were sawn and marked and sitting in the yard when the railroad gave notice that the branch was coming up. He said the company that had leased the working sent a man out in a car who stood in the yard for 10 minutes and then said the freight would eat the job and to shut her down. He said the crew scaled the faces and greased the derrick and shut the gate on a Friday and were told to come back Monday, and nobody ever came back at all. "How many blocks?" Alma asked. 200 in some, Bill said. "We had a tally sheet. Mert Cole kept it. I couldn't tell you where a tally sheet goes after 50 years. And it's still worth something? Stone that's laid out in the weather that long?" Buell Ivers looked out at the street a while. "Alma," he said, "it's stone." She went home and slept badly and got up at 4:30 and started counting. It took her 9 days. She did it the way she had done everything else in her life, which was 1 row at a time with a pencil and no fuss. And she took a piece of school chalk from the drawer where the grandchildren's things had ended up, and she marked a white slash on the end of every block she counted so she would not count it twice. She kept the numbers on the back of a feed store calendar. She learned to tell the yard blocks from the platform blocks, and both of those from the 4 big pieces standing by themselves at the head of the tramway that Buell later told her were column stock. She got briar scratches on the backs of both hands, and one on her cheek that Sherry noticed at church and asked about, and Alma said she had been cleaning out fence line, which was true enough that she did not have to think about it afterward. 241. That was the count. 241 dressed blocks lying in the open on the top of the junk hill, plus the 4 column pieces, plus whatever was under the water. On the 6th day of the counting, she had found the tool house. It stood at the head of the tramway with cedars grown so tight against the west wall that she had walked past it twice without seeing it for what it was, a low building of the same gray buff stone as everything else, laid up in courses a foot thick with a slate roof that it held and a plank door hung on strap hinges. The door was not locked. It had swelled and settled into the frame the way a door does when a hill has been breathing on it for 50 years, and it took her the hoe handle and both shoulders and a good deal of language she would not have used in front of the minister to get it to give. Inside it was dry. That was what she told Buell Ivers afterward, and what he said he would have bet money on. Because a stone building with a slate roof and a stone floor does not rot, it only waits. There were hand tools on a rack, points and pitching chisels and a 9-pound sledge, and the wooden handles had gone gray and light as balsa, but the steel was only skinned over with rust. There was a barrel of channeling bits. There was a bench with a vis on it, and above the bench a nail, and on the nail a tally book with a limp black cover, and when Alma Rennick took it down, the dust came off it in one sheet. Mert Cole's writing was small and square, and he had ruled his own columns with a straightage. Every block that came off that ledge in the last 2 seasons was in it. The date it was cut, the bench it came off, the dimensions in feet and inches, the estimated weight, the course letter and the number that got craned on the end, and in the last column, on the ones that had gone out, the car number of the flat that hauled it. The last dated entry was the 10th of October, 1952. After it, there were 5 more lines of blocks entered with no car number against any of them, and then a page and a half of nothing, and then, in a different hand, in pencil, the words, "Shut down Fry. Take tools in." She sat down on the bench in a stone building on top of her own 40 acres and read a dead man's arithmetic for 2 hours. When she got to the summary page at the back, she found that Mert Cole had carried a running total of the yard the way a careful man does, and the last figure he ever wrote in it was 245. 241 dressed blocks in the yard and on the platform, and 4 pieces of column stock standing separate at the head of the tramway. It was her own number to the piece. A man with a straightedge and a pencil had counted that yard on a Friday afternoon in 1952 and hung the book on a nail and gone home. And half a century later, a woman in a mustard cardigan had counted it again with a stub of school chalk on her knees in the grass with briar scratches on the backs of both hands, and the 2 of them agreed exactly. And there was not a soul alive to tell it to but Buell Ivers. So that was the evening she went into town again with the tally book on the seat beside her, and Buell Ivers put his glasses on and turned the pages very slowly with one finger and did not say anything for a long time, and then said, "That's Mert's hand," and had to stop and look out at the street. He talked more that night than he had the first time. He named the crew for her, all of them, the way old men can, the sawyers and the channel runners and the derrick man and the blacksmith, who had a shop down at the section line and shod half the township on the side. He told her the order they had been cutting was for a state building east of here, courses and steps and window surrounds, and that the drawings had been tacked up in the tool house, and that a man came out from the architect twice a year and walked the yard with a folding rule and rejected anything with so much as a shell in it. He said the crew took the reject stone home, and it is in a dozen foundations and 4 chimneys in Wexler County to this day. And that if she looked at the front step of the Methodist church, she would be looking at her own hill. Buell, Alma said, "Why did nobody ever come back?" He shrugged the way a man shrugs about weather. Railroad pulled the rails in the spring. Company had beds down south they could load onto a main line. Wasn't a soul in this county with the money to run it themselves. And the Rennicks were farming by then and doing well at it, and every year that goes by, it's easier to say next year. He handed the book back. And then one day, the men that knew are all dead, but one, and the boys grow up looking at cedars. She kept the tally book on the table under the window with the deed. Meanwhile, the county went on the way a county does, which is to say that people talked about her house and not her hill. Sherry told the ladies at church that they had gotten Alma settled in the little house and she was doing just fine, and it was so much less for her to keep up. Somebody asked Dale in the co-op parking lot in early July whether it was true his mother had a man out with a transit on the north end. And Dale said his mother had gotten a notion about the rock pot pile and was spending good money to have somebody measure briars, and the men laughed, and one of them told Buell Ivers about it that same afternoon, and Buell Ivers said nothing whatsoever, which for Buell was a form of comment. Alma heard all of it. In a township of 400 people, you hear all of it, generally twice. She found she did not mind as much as she had expected to. What she minded was something smaller and older and harder to say out loud, which was that in April, at her own kitchen table, both her sons had been so certain of what she was and what she knew that neither one of them had watched her face while she signed. She spent those evenings with the deed. She had read it so many times by then that she had the rider by heart. And she got in the habit of taking one line of it a night, the way some people take a verse, and turning it over. together with all quarry rights, quarry privileges, and all stone, quarried and unquarried, lying in and upon said premises. Quarried and unquarried. That was the phrase that kept her up. A man in 1890-something had written those 4 words into a conveyance, and they had come forward through every deed since, and they meant that the stone standing in the yard and the stone still lying 80 feet thick in the dark under the cedars were the same thing in the eyes of the law, and both of them were hers. And neither of her sons had ever in his life read a whole page of the paper that made him a landowner. Together with the derrick, tramway, rails, tools, and all cut and dressed block presently lying in the quarry yard. Presently, written in 1952, about a yard that was full and carried forward, word for word. Into a conveyance signed at an oilcloth table in April by 2 men in clean shirts who thought they were being generous, said right of way to run with the land and to bind the heirs and assigns of the grantors forever. Alma Rennick was not a vengeful woman, and she did not lie awake enjoying that sentence, but she read it more than once. And that was when Alma Rennick did the thing that changed the shape of the rest of it, and it was not a dramatic thing. She did not call a lawyer, and she did not call her sons, and she did not call the paper. She put on a clean cardigan and drove into town on a Wednesday morning and climbed the courthouse steps, which are gray buff stone with a warm grain that lights up in the sun. And she went to the recorder's office and asked Doris Pyle if a person could look at the old records on their own ground. Doris Pyle had been Register of Deeds in Wexler County for 29 years, and she loved nothing on this earth so much as somebody asking her that question. She brought the abstract books up from the vault 2 at a time. They went back through the chain of title on that 40 for 130 years, deed by deed, and every single instrument in the chain carried the quarry language forward, sometimes typed, sometimes copied by hand in a clerk's round script from the original conveyance out of a man who had come up from the river in a wagon and had never in his life imagined that the great-great-grandsons of the man he sold to would look at a ridge full of dimension stone and call it the junk. They found the driller's logs from before the war in a book of miscellaneous instruments where nobody had looked at them in 70 years. 81 feet of solid ledge in the first hole, 79 in the second, 84 in the third, taken at the north line. They found the lease the company had signed in 1946 and the release it had filed in 1953 when it walked away. And on the release, in the last paragraph, in the language of a company shutting a door behind itself, was the sentence that made Doris Pyle put her finger down on the page and stop reading out loud. All materials, cut stone, plant, and equipment remaining upon the premises are hereby surrendered and quit-claimed to the owner of the fee. The blocks in the yard did not belong to some company back east. They had been given back to the ground they sat on. And the ground they sat on since the 9th of May belonged to a 78-year-old woman in a mended cardigan. "Alma," said Doris Pyle, "does Dale know what's on that hill?" "Dale," Alma said, "has been calling it the junk since he was 6 years old." There was one more thing in the abstract, and it was the thing that Alma read 4 times in the vault and then had Doris photocopy for a nickel a page. It was the right of way. The hauling road 40 feet wide, running from the quarry yard south along the old stone road to the section line. In 1952, that road had been a farm track over the top of nothing much. But a right-of-way is described where it lies, and where it lay was straight down through the northwest quarter, which is to say straight down through the middle of the best black bottom in Wexler County, which is to say straight through what was now, since the 9th of May, Dale Rennick's cornfield. And the words on the paper said it ran with the land and bound the heirs and assigns of the grantors forever. Her sons had signed her 40 acres of rock, and with it, without reading it, they had signed her a road through their own crop. Alma paid Doris $4.60 for the copies and drove home and did not tell one living soul for 2 weeks. What she did instead was hire a surveyor out of her own money, out of the egg money and the certificate her mother had left her, and the surveyor was Lyle Mowbray, who was in his 50s, sunburned to the collar, and who worked out of the back of a truck with his son and would not take a job he could not finish. He set his instrument in the courthouse control and worked the section lines, and it took him 3 days on the hill in the heat with the briars, and on the 4th day he came down and sat on Alma's porch step and drank 2 glasses of water before he said anything at all. "The whole cut's inside your line," he said. "Not close. The nearest face is 190 feet in from the north line and better than 400 from the west. Whoever laid that quarry out laid it out to stay on the deed. You've got the yard, the platform, the derrick, the tramway all the way down to where it quits, and the top of the ledge daylights along your whole east side. And the road?" Lyle Mowbray took his hat off and turned it around in his hands. "Mrs. Rennick, that easement is as clean a description as I've read in 20 years. Bearings and distances, monumented at both ends. I found the south pin in the fence line with a shovel. It's 40 feet wide and it goes right through the middle of your son's field, and every deed since has carried it. Which means it isn't lost and it isn't abandoned, and there's not a thing on God's earth he can do about it but grow corn on either side of it." The two of them sat on the porch, step a while, with the tin roof ticking as it cooled. "You want my honest opinion," Lyle said. "You need somebody in the stone trade up there before you say a word to anybody. Because I can measure it and I can tell you where it is. I can't tell you what it is." The man who could was Ed Kennard, who ran a cut stone yard 60 miles north and had been shipping sills and steps and church facings out of the same beds for 31 years, and who did not believe one word of it on the telephone. He came anyway on a Tuesday in June. Because men in the stone trade are all of them, at bottom, people who cannot stand not to look. He walked the yard first, and he did it in silence, going block to block with a 2-pound hammer and hitting each one once on the corner and listening. He climbed down into the first bench and put his hand flat on the cut face and stood there like a man reading with his palm. He got out a bottle of something and dripped it on the stone and watched it. He went out to the 4-column pieces and got down on his knees in the grass and looked at the end grain of one of them for so long that Lyle Mowbray asked if he was all right. And then Ed Kennard stood up in the middle of a 40-acre parcel that the tax rolls of Wexler County carried at $900. And he said, "Ma'am, who else has been up here?" "My surveyor," Alma said, "and a man who worked it when he was a boy. Nobody from the trade." "No. All right," he said. "Then I'll tell it to you straight, because you'll hear it crooked from somebody else inside a month." He put his hammer in his belt. "That's a live quarry. Everything about it is live. The faces are square and scaled, and the benches are open, which means a crew could set up and start taking stone in a week and a half, and I have not seen that anywhere in this state in my lifetime. The ledge is mill block, no seam, no shell, blue-hearted, and if those drill logs say 80 feet then, 80 feet is what you have got under most of this hill. The blocks in the yard are not junk, and they are not scrap. Weather does not hurt this stone, ma'am. It gets harder in the air. Those blocks are sound, they are sawn, they are dressed on 4 sides, and there is a market for exactly that material in restoration work today that there was not a market for when they were cut. There are 241 of them, Alma said. "I know," said Ed Kennard. "I counted 160 before I quit and started figuring instead." He figured on the back of a delivery ticket on the hood of his truck for 11 minutes while a small old woman in a mustard cardigan stood beside him with her arms folded. Then he turned it around. For the cut block lying in the yard, on the skids, dressed and marked, he would give her $61 a ton, loaded on his own trucks at his own cost, which on the tonnage he estimated came to something better than $88,000 for stone she had thought was a briar patch 9 weeks earlier. For the ledge itself, he did not want to give her anything, and he said so. And he said the reason was that no honest man in his trade would give an owner a lump sum for a bed like that one. Because a lump sum is how a man with money takes a bed like that away from a woman who is 78. What he offered instead was a lease. $11,000 a year against a royalty of $1 and 60 cents a ton on every ton that came off the hill, paid quarterly, with the scale tickets open to her inspection, and the quarry to be worked by a local crew. And the whole thing to fall in on him and revert to her if he let a year go by without taking stone. You'll want a lawyer to read that, he said. You'll want one that isn't from around here. Mr. Kinnard, Alma said, what would you say that ledge is worth, all told, if a person just wanted to know? He looked up the hill at the gray rim of the cut with the cedars on it and the derrick standing over the whole business with its cable hanging. Ma'am, he said, I'd say don't ask me. Ask the county. They've got to put a number on it now anyway, and it'll be a number a courthouse has to stand behind. She took his advice about the lawyer. The one she found was Marlene Fitch, 2 counties over, a woman in her 40s with a plain office over a bakery and a reputation for reading every line of a mineral lease out loud to her clients, whether they wanted it or not. Marlene Fitch read the lease Ed Kinnard had drafted, and then she read the deed, and then she asked Alma to sit still for a minute while she read the deed again. Mrs. Rennick, she said, do you understand what your sons handed you? I'm beginning to. They didn't hand you 40 acres. They handed you 40 acres and everything the deed carries with it, and this deed carries the quarry, the plant, the block in the yard, and a hauling easement across the best ground in your township. That last one alone would be worth arguing about if anybody wanted to argue. The rest of it isn't even arguable. It's just yours. It has been yours since the 9th of May, and it was your husband's before that, and his father's before that, and every one of them signed it forward without reading the middle of the page. Marlene Fitch made 4 changes to the lease, and Ed Kinnard accepted 3 of them and argued the 4th into a compromise, which Marlene said was the mark of a man who intended to be around in 10 years. But Alma did not sign it yet. She had one thing she wanted to do first, and when she explained it, both Marlene Fitch and Ed Kinnard told her she was making a mistake, and she did it anyway, and it turned out to be the single smartest thing anybody in that family did in 50 years. She went to the county and asked to have her own taxes raised. Vernon Tackett had been the Wexler County assessor for 19 years. He was a stocky, careful man in his 60s with a silver brush mustache and wire-rimmed glasses and a short-sleeved white shirt with a clip-on tie, and he had spent 2 decades listening to people explain, in every register from weeping to shouting, why their ground was worth less than his card said. Nobody had ever come through his door and told him a card was too low. When Alma Rennick sat down across from him and said she believed the North 40 in Section 11 was carried wrong and she would like it looked at, he wrote it down twice because he thought he had misheard the first time. You understand this would raise your bill, Mrs. Rennick. I do. Considerably, if there's anything to it. Mr. Tackett, she said, I'd rather pay what a thing is worth than have somebody tell me later I didn't. He said he would put her on the list for the fall. She said the cedars would be into everything by fall, and the light in the cut was best in the morning, and something in the way she said the cut made Vernon Tackett look up from his card file. He came out that Thursday. He came out expecting 20 minutes of work. He had the plat, the old card with $900 typed on it in a machine that had not been in that office since before he was hired, a clipboard, a steel measuring wheel, and the resigned patience of a man doing a favor for a widow with a bee in her bonnet. He parked at the hired man's house and looked up the hill at a wall of cedars and said, out loud, that he did not see how anybody made a case for reassessing a briar patch. Alma walked him up the tramway. She showed him the rails under the leaf mold first, because she had learned by then that it worked best in that order. She showed him the gate with the letter holes in the sign. She took him around the cedar in the cable and out onto the yard. And she stopped where she had stopped in May, and she let the county assessor of Wexler County walk the last 20 feet by himself. Vernon Tackett came to the rim of the cut and stopped so suddenly that the measuring wheel got away from him and rolled 6 feet and fell over on its side in the chips. He did not say anything for a long time. He went along the rim to the corner and looked down the east face where the Chandler grooves run floor to water. He came back and looked at the benches. He went out into the yard and put his hand on a block and then on the next one, and then he stood in front of the row of them under the derrick and turned all the way around once, slowly, looking at 241 dressed blocks lying in the sun, and the color went out of his face. Alma said afterward that she had heard the phrase all her life and had never once seen it happen to a person. He went pale. He was a heavy man with a farmer's neck and a lifetime of sunburn on him, and every bit of the blood went out from under it. And he took his glasses off and put them back on and said to nobody, "This is carried at $900. Then he sat down on a block of dimension limestone with his clipboard on his knees like a man who needs to be lower down than he was. "Mrs. Rennick," he said, "how long has this been up here?" "Since 1952. And the county's had it at $22.50 an acre since 1952. $22.50, Alma agreed. Vernon Tackett was quiet, and then he laughed one short, unhappy laugh at himself and his office and the whole machinery of a courthouse that had let a thing like that sit on a card for half a century, and he said, "Ma'am, I am going to have to bring people out here. I can't set this one. I don't have a comparable. I don't have anything within 100 miles of a comparable." He brought people out. He brought the county engineer to look at the benches in the Hall Road, and he brought a mineral appraiser up from the State Association who spent 2 days on the hill with the drill logs from the miscellaneous book and a core rig on a trailer. And he brought Ed Kinnard back, formally this time, to certify grade and marketability in writing. The proof came back clean. The mineral appraiser put 80.5 feet of workable ledge under 31 of the 40 acres, and he put a recoverable figure on it in tons that had a comma in it that Alma had to have explained to her twice, and he wrote in his summary, in the flat language of a man who is paid to be careful, that the property was approved an immediately workable dimension stone reserve with existing plant and existing inventory, and that in his professional opinion there was no comparable parcel in current inventory in the state. It was around the second week of July that Dale Rennick figured out something was going on. What he saw first was Lyle Mowbray's lath. He was cultivating the northwest quarter, and there were survey stakes in his corn, a line of them with orange ribbon running from the fence at the section line north through the field on a bearing that did not match any line he knew. He pulled the first one up. There was another one 40 paces on. He pulled that one too, and when he got to the end of the field, there was a pin set in concrete in the fence line that he could not pull up with anything he owned, and it had been there, from the look of the concrete, since before he was born. He came down to the 2-room house that evening with dirt on him and stood in the door and asked his mother what in the hell she had a surveyor in his field for. "It isn't your field," Alma said. "That part's a road." "What part is a road?" 40 feet of it. "It's in the deed, Dale. It's been in the deed since 1952. It goes with my 40, and it comes down to the section line, and it says so on the paper you had Ray Ludden draw up." Dale did not go get the paper. That was the thing Alma noticed and never forgot, that even then, standing in a doorway being told there was a right of way through the middle of his corn, her son did not go and get the document and read it. He told her instead. He told her that nobody had used any road up there in 50 years, which meant it was gone. He told her that she was 78 years old and some slick outfit had gotten hold of her, and that Kinnard's truck had been seen twice at the co-op and that people were talking. He told her that if she had gotten some notion about that rock pile, she should have come to her sons about it. Because that was what family was for. "You're the one that gave it to me," she said. "Ma, we gave you a house." "You gave me a house on my own ground," Alma said, "and a deed I read, which is more than either one of you did." Curtis came out on Sunday, which was the part of it she had expected and dreaded, because Curtis was the one who was good at this. He brought a coffee cake, and he sat down at her table, and he was warm and easy for 20 minutes about Teresa's job at the co-op and the dry June, and then he came around to it sideways, the way you turn a gate. He said the family had been thinking. He said that with the way land was going and the way taxes were going, it might be smart to put everything, the bottom and the road 80 and the north 40, into one entity with all three of their names on it, so it would be managed as one operation, the way Dad would have wanted, and so that nobody could get at any of it. He had already had a form drawn up. He had it in the truck. He said it would not change a thing about who lived where or who did what, and that she would be a member the same as them. "Curtis," Alma said, "what would my share be?" "A third. And what would the hill be worth to that entity?" Her younger son, who sold crop insurance for a living and understood perfectly well what he was asking her for, looked at his coffee. "Ma, we're not trying to take anything from you." "No," Alma said. "You already did that in April, and it was legal, and I signed it, and I've never said one word against it to a living soul in this county. But this is the second time you've come to this table with a paper already drawn up before you asked me. And I'm going to tell you what I've learned since the last one." She turned her cup around on the oilcloth. "It's all in the middle of the page, Curtis, every bit of it. Nobody reads the middle of the page." He left the coffee cake. In August, the notices went out. In Wexler County, the assessor mails the changed valuations and then sits at a table in the township hall for a public meeting of the Board of Review, and anybody whose number moved can come and be heard. And it is ordinarily a slow evening with 4 farmers and a man who wants his machine shed reclassified. That August, the hall was full at 10 minutes to 7. And there were people standing along the back wall, and there were 3 men there from the paper and the co-op and the bank who did not have one thing on the agenda and had come anyway, because in a county that talks. Everybody had heard a piece of it by then, and nobody had heard the number. Alma Rennick came in at 5 minutes to 7 in the mustard cardigan, with Marlene Fitch on one side of her and Buell Ivers, who had insisted, moving slow on the other, and she sat down in the 3rd row where she had sat for a school board meeting in 1971. Dale was already there. Dale was in the front row with a folder of his own. Because Dale had a complaint on the agenda, his corn ground had come back from the assessor with a notation on it he had never seen before, an encumbrance line, and he wanted it off. The board went through the ordinary business first, the way boards do, and it took 40 minutes, and nobody in that hall heard a word of it. A machine shed got reclassified. A man from the north end argued about a pond. Then the chairman looked at his sheet and said, "Parcel 11-04-40, North 40, Section 11, Rennick." And the room went so quiet that you could hear the window fan. Vernon Tackett stood up with a folder. He was not a showman, and he did not enjoy 1 minute of it. He said, for the record, that the parcel had been carried on the books of Wexler County at $900 since the assessment of 1953, that the classification had been waste ground, and that in his judgment the county had been wrong for 50 years, and he included himself in that, since 19 of those years were his. Then he said he wanted to read the physical findings into the public record so that every part of it would be in the minutes where anybody could see how the number was arrived at, and the chairman told him to go ahead, and Vernon Tackett read it aloud. He read the surveyor's certificate, the quarry cut, the yard, the platform, the derrick, and the tramway, all lying wholly within the boundaries of the parcel. He read the drill logs out of the miscellaneous book, 81 feet and 79 feet and 84 feet of solid ledge. He read the mineral appraiser's finding of 80.5 feet of workable dimension stone under 31 of the 40 acres and the recoverable tonnage, and the phrase proved an immediately workable reserve with existing plant and existing inventory. He read the certification of grade from a cut stone operator of 31 years standing. He read the count of dressed block lying in the yard, 241 pieces, plus 4 column stock. And then he read the deed. He read the granting clause, in fee simple, together with all in singular the tenements, hereditaments, and appurtenances thereunto belonging, and he read the rider out of 1952, all quarry rights, quarry privileges, and all stone. Quarried and unquarried, lying in and upon said premises, together with the derrick, tramway, rails, tools, and all cut and dressed block, presently lying in the quarry yard, and the right-of-way for hauling, 40 feet in width, from said quarry yard south along the old stone road to the section line, over and across the northwest quarter. Said right-of-way to run with the land and to bind the heirs and assigns of the grantors forever. He put the deed down. Accordingly, Vernon Tackett said, the board is asked to approve a corrected valuation on parcel 11-04-40 of $942,000. Nobody moved. Somewhere in the back, a man said a word he should not have said in a township hall. And somebody else laughed the way people laugh when they are startled, and the chairman had to say order twice. Then Vernon Tackett, who was an honest man having the worst and best evening of his working life, turned over one more page. And for the record and for comparison, he said, since it will be asked. The adjoining parcels in the same conveyance, being the home place and the road 80. 320 acres of Class 1 bottom and 80 acres of Class 2 carry a combined corrected valuation of $864,000. That was the moment. Alma Rennick said later that she did not feel triumphant, and she did not feel like crying, and she did not feel much of anything except a kind of far-off amazement at the arithmetic, that a thing everybody had agreed to call the junk was carried on the books of her own county at $78,000 more than the entire farm her sons had divided between them. Dale was in the front row. He had come with a folder to argue about an encumbrance line on his corn ground, and he had sat there while the county assessor read out into the public record. In front of the co-op manager and the banker and 2 men from the paper and 11 of his neighbors, exactly what was on the hill his family had been calling the junk since before he could read, and exactly what the paper he had brought to his mother's kitchen in April had conveyed along with it. He stood up when they got to his item. His face was red where Vernon Tackett's had gone white. He said the easement was ancient and unused and ought to be stricken. Marlene Fitch stood up in the 3rd row and said, politely, that an easement of record described by bearing and distance, monumented at both ends, carried forward in every instrument in the chain of title, and expressly stated to run with the land, is not extinguished by anybody's failure to drive a truck on it, and that her client had no wish to inconvenience anybody, but did intend to use her. Road. The board's own attorney, sitting at the end of the table, said, "That's the law of it," in the tone of a man who would rather have been fishing. The chairman asked Dale if he wished to say anything further. Dale Rennick stood in the front of the township hall with his hat in his hands, and what he said, in the end, was, "I didn't know that was in there." "No, sir," said Vernon Tackett, not unkindly. "It appears nobody read it." The paper ran it that Thursday on the front page above the fold. The headline was plain, and the county talked about nothing else for a month. And the part everybody repeated to each other, the part that got said at the co-op scale and in the church parking lot and over every kitchen table in the township, was not the number. It was the sentence somebody had used at the hall and somebody else had carried out the door with them. The sons split the farm and signed their mother the junk hill, and the deed included the quarry. That is what a county remembers, not the tonnage and not the valuation, the shape of the thing. The next weeks were not soft ones. Sherry stopped speaking to her, which lasted until Christmas. Curtis called twice and then wrote a letter, and the letter was 3 pages long, and the first 2 pages were about how it had looked from where he stood, and the third page said he was sorry, which was more than Alma had expected and less than she had hoped for, and she wrote him back and told him to come for dinner and bring Teresa. Dale said nothing at all for 9 weeks. Then in October, he drove up the north lane with a load of crushed rock in the truck, and he backed it around and he spread it on the first 100 feet of the hauling road where it came out of the field onto the section line, because the trucks were going to tear it up otherwise, and he knew it and she knew it, and neither one of them said one word about that or about anything else. He brought him a jar of water. He drank it standing by the tailgate. Before he left, he looked up the hill at the derrick, standing over the cedars with its cable hanging, and he said, "Dad know about all that?" "Your father never went up there in his life," Alma said. "None of you did. It was in the paper the whole time." She signed the lease in September, and Ed Kinnard's crew was on the hill in 11 days, and the first thing they did was not cut stone. They cleared the cedars off the yard and set new skids under 241 blocks that had been sitting crooked since 1952, and they ran a new cable to the derrick's boom point. And on the 4th morning, Alma Rennick stood at the edge of the yard in her cardigan and watched a stiff-legged derrick that had hung idle for half a century pick a 6-ton block of dressed limestone off the ground and swing it, slow and easy as a man turning in his sleep, onto a flatbed truck. Buell Ivers was there for that. He had made his granddaughter drive him out, and he stood with his hat off, and when the block came up he said, "That's the sound," and would not explain what he meant, and Alma did not need him to. The crew was 7 men and then 11, and 9 of them were from Wexler County, and one of them was Buell's grandson Wade, who had been driving to a plant 60 miles the other way for 6 years and now drove 4 miles. The trucks went out loaded down the old stone road through the middle of the best black bottom in the township on a lane 40 feet wide that Alma had graveled at her own cost, with a fence set on both sides at her own cost, so that no truck ever put a wheel in her son's corn. She insisted on that, and she paid for it, and she never once mentioned it to him, and Dale, who is not a stupid man, understood exactly what it meant, and it took him a year and a half to be able to say so. The first check for the block in the yard came in November. It was $88,120, and Alma Rennick took it to the bank in town in her cardigan and stood at the counter while the young woman behind it tried to keep her face still, and then she went across the square and paid her taxes for the year, the whole raised bill, in one payment at the treasurer's window, which she had wanted to do since the day in June when a county assessor sat down on a block of limestone and told her he had no comparable. The royalty checks started the following spring, and they came quarterly, and they were not a fortune in any one quarter, $1.60 a ton on what came off the hill, but they came, and they kept coming. And by the second year, the arithmetic of Alma Rennick's life had changed in a way that a woman who has kept a farm ledger for 54 years understands better than most people. She did not move. That was the thing everybody asked about, and it was the thing she found hardest to explain to people who had not lived in a 2-room house at the end of a lane and found out it suited them. She put a new roof on the hired man's house and a real stove in it, and a window on the north side so she could see the hill, and she stayed. What she did with the rest of it was mostly quiet. She put money into the ground she still owned. She paid for the drilling of a new well at the little house and let the crew tie the quarry office into it. She paid off the note Teresa had taken for 2 years of school and told her granddaughter it was not a gift, it was wages, because Teresa had come out and kept the tally book and the scale tickets every Saturday for a year and a half without ever being asked twice. And in the third summer, when the county advertised for bids on the restoration of the courthouse steps, which had been cut out of that same ridge in 1891 and had been spalling for 20 years, the stone came up the road from Kinnard's yard already dressed, and every course of it had come off the North 40 in Section 11, and the county paid the going rate for it, and Alma Rennick would not take $1 off the price. They carried my ground at $900 for 50 years, she told Doris Pyle at the recorder's window. I'm not going to make it up to them by discounting stone. Doris Pyle laughed until she had to sit down. The talk in the county went the way talk goes, and it settled, finally, into the version that has been told at that co-op ever since, which is shorter than the truth and truer than most short things. 2 grown men divided their mother's farm at her own kitchen table. They took the house and the barns and the black bottom, and they handed her 40 acres of rock and called it fair, and they were so certain of what that ground was worth that not one of them turned over the second page. And what they signed away, in the middle of a page, in language that had been carried forward through 130 years of deeds by clerks who did not know what it meant either, was approved limestone quarry, a standing derrick, a tramway, 241 dressed blocks lying in the grass, and a road 40 feet wide straight through the field they had kept for themselves. Alma never sued anybody and never asked for anything back, and never, in all the years afterward, said one hard word about her sons in public. When the paper came out to do a follow-up piece the next spring, the young man asked her the question everybody wanted asked, which was whether she felt her children had cheated her. She thought about it long enough that he got his pen ready. No, she said. They didn't cheat me. They just didn't read. He wrote that down, and it ended up as the last line of the article, and it is on the wall in the co-op office to this day, cut out and taped up and gone yellow. She kept the tin box on the table under the window where the light was best. The deed was in it, the recorded copy with the county stamp bled through purple on the back. And beside it, Marlene Fitch's letter and the surveyor's plat and the mineral appraiser's report and the first scale ticket the crew ever wrote, and on top of all of it, a piece of school chalk worn down to a stub. Sometimes on a winter evening, when the wind came across the bottom and the tin roof ticked, Alma Rennick would take the deed out and read it again. And she never once skipped the part that people skip. Together with all and singular the tenements, hereditaments, and appurtenances thereunto belonging, or in any wise appertaining. It is not beautiful language, and nobody says it out loud, and it had been sitting in that family's papers, patient as stone, through 4 generations of men who farmed the flat ground and looked at the ridge and saw nothing but cedars. A deed does not forget. That is the whole of what she learned, and she was 78 years old before anybody handed her a piece of paper worth reading. Everything a place is comes with it, written down in the middle of the page, waiting for somebody to sit down at a kitchen table with a cup of tea and their glasses on and take the time.